Usually in the October timeframe is when an agency is going to start developing concept papers, or sometimes they're called program revision requests, if I use the term PRR. And that is really looking at big ticketed items, policy changes, requested legislative changes, things of that nature. Once you go through that process, then normally in December timeframe, roughly, is usually when agencies will be finalizing their budget and actually submitting it over to a governor's budget office, who then normally will take January, February timeframe to kind of put it all together. Then usually from April through June, the legislature is going to do what the legislature does, and hopefully enact a budget or present a budget for signature for July 1 start date. And that normally once that occurs, that's when you basically get your spending authority to go ahead and start using those funds appropriately. But once you go through the rebudget process, you got right around the corner this thing called the federal budget. Budget folks never really get a chance to cycle down. It's a continuous year-long process, wash, rinse, repeat.
Today's guest spent 37 years on the buying side in state government. Chief Technology Officer for Pennsylvania, State CIO for the state of Washington, and most recently, Secretary and State CIO of North Carolina at the cabinet level. He's a past president of NASCIO, the National Association of State CIOs, and as of January, he switched to the other side of the table as a national strategy advisor at Everpure. In this conversation, we're going to cover what the job of a state CIO actually is, how money and initiatives get formed and move through a state, and how to win that ever, challenging RFP, and how to get disqualified in the first 10 minutes without knowing it. Jim Weaver, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Mike. Thank you for having me.
So let's start at the highest level. I'd love to hear your perspective on what is the job of a state CIO actually. When you wake up in the morning, what are you actually responsible and what are you not?
That's a great question, Mike. I jokingly talk about this, and I use the analogy of 29 days of the month getting punched by Mike Tyson, and then one day getting to do something that's really fun and invigorating and impactful that rejuvenates you for the next 29 days of getting punched by Mike Tyson. With that in mind, the state CIO really at the end of the day is the chief technology advisor, if you will, for the governor and to accomplish the governor's mission, objectives, business outcomes that he or she's looking for across the state constituency. It's that intermediary bridge between talking about technology initiatives from the governor's perspective and over into the legislative perspective. So if you think about the fact the governor being the CEO of a company and the legislature being the shareholders of the company, and the ones that will authorize the funding streams that might be necessary to go ahead and get some of those objectives done. It is not about managing IT. And I know that's a misnomer a lot of times. I think that it's about focusing on the IT. And yes, there is a component of IT in it. Let's be honest. If the trains aren't showing up on time, if basic operational things are not occurring, then yes, it's going to derail a state CIO's ability to get his or her job done. But really, at the end of the day, from a CIO perspective, it's about the relationship building. It's about understanding the business objectives that need to be accomplished, not only from the governor's perspective, but your fellow cabinet members as well, because they all are running very diverse businesses as well. And how do you enable those opportunities? And then making sure that you're doing it in a safe, compliant, acknowledging regulatory frameworks that may be out there, but really at the end of the day, not being Dr. No, but maybe not this way, but this is how we can go ahead and try to get this accomplished for you. So it's that, it's that skill set of being able to enable a bunch of juggling balls that you got up in the air, and trying to get to the outcomes that everybody is trying to look for, while also understanding that your responsibilities are to protect the state.
Got it. So there's definitely what I'm hearing is there's definitely the blocking and tackling of making sure that the as you put it, the trains.
Right. If you can't block and tackle, you're not running any complex offensive plays, right? Yeah.
Right. Yeah. But you're making sure all the systems are operational.
Right.
And that's probably, I would imagine in that realm, that's where a lot of urgent, maybe non-strategic things come up that, maybe that's where some of the Mike Tyson punches come from. But then on the other hand, you're advancing the governor's
Mhm.
agenda and trying to interface with the various different cabinet level agencies in order to get those things done and
Correct.
support them from a technology
Correct.
perspective. Is that
That's
fair?
fair. And again, too, you also realize very quickly, and after doing this for some time, that the cabinet agencies do have funding sources that can enable the objectives you're trying to achieve as well. So strategic partnerships and alignment with them creates lots of benefits and windfalls to enable the opportunities you have in front of you to go ahead and get things done as well.
Yeah, that's a great point, and I would love for you to expand on that. And that actually is a segue into where I wanted to go next, which is like walk me through the org chart. So there's the state CIO. I don't know if you would put them at the center or not, but then other cabinet agencies, they might have their own technology leadership as well. As you pointed out, they have their own funding sources
Mhm.
sometimes. What does that look like day in day out? Who's like deciding what gets prioritized?
Well, you'll quickly, if you haven't heard the old saying, you've been to one state, you've been to one state. So having basically worked across three
Yeah,
different states that had different operating models, different authorizing environments, those are the key tenets that you have to understand. You need to understand your enabling legislation. You also need to understand, even with your enabling legislation, what you will be allowed to do and what you will not be allowed to do as well. It also depends on how the state's operating. Is the state centralized? Is it decentralized? Because those are all different things that will, the level of autonomy that an agency
right.
may have, and then more importantly, the IT teams that are supporting those agencies. So obviously, in a centralized environment, most part those IT teams are answering into the central IT organization that's normally headed by the state CIO. So in the case of
Yeah,
I don't want to say North Carolina, in the case of Pennsylvania as an example, we were very much a part of that centralization effort under Governor Wolf, brought the teams together. So those agency IT teams were essentially part of our staff at the end of the day. But
okay.
at the end of the day, too, though, we also understood very clearly that they had business objectives that needed to get done. And you had some agencies that had lots of funding, and you have some agencies with very little funding. So what we had done was the concept of a delivery center that brought agencies with similar business processes together. And obviously, there was ones that were well funded and ones that were less funded. But the opportunities became there then that a more well-funded agency opportunity could directly benefit a less funded or lesser funded agency. I'll give you the example of vehicle registration. So Department of Transportation in PA was redoing their vehicle
Yeah,
registration system. Well, when you think about ATVs, you think about snowmobiles, you think about boats. They all do vehicle registrations as well. Maybe just not in the sense if you think about it. And as we were going through the business process requirements, at the end of the day, the flows were not that much different. I would say it was probably in the neighborhood of 85% of similarity of business processes across the board that DOT did versus the two other agencies that were involved in registration processes. And really, at the end of the day, what it really came down to in Pennsylvania, they eliminated the need for the vehicle registration sticker on a license plate. They fall off, whatever, and it saved about $7 million in just mailing costs a year sending those stickers out. And as you know too, if you're unfortunate to get pulled over, a police officer more than likely is going to run your tags anyway, and is going to know whether or not your car is registered, et cetera, et cetera. So having that little sticker there, at the end of the day, was a
yeah,
nice to have thing. But going through this
okay.
process, just looking at vehicle registration stickers, the Coast Guard still requires the blue sticker on a boat. But all the other vehicle entities, if you want to think of it in that regard, did not need the sticker. That was just something that was
Got it.
past practice. It was something that was always done. So as you were able to bring these business processes together, you were starting to enable other opportunities. So really, at the end of the day, by leveraging a system the DOT was going to build anyway, we were able to pull through a number of smaller agencies with much similar business processes and get them, you know, application modernization efforts underway to some good successes
Yeah,
there. So those are the kind of examples there. Now, when my time in the state of Washington, it was decentralized. Everybody
okay.
operated differently. There were attempts to kind of bring some things together through work groups. that the governor would spearhead through executive order, like across the human services entities, if you will, so social services, healthcare, finance, children, youth, and families, as an example. My office as the state CIO's office as the technology arm, and work through those type of opportunities. How do you best leverage funding streams? How do you do those modernization efforts? How can we make sure we're pulling through everybody and getting to the outcomes that Washingtonians needed, not necessarily looking at it from blinders of a particular or singular agency perspective. And then likewise in North Carolina as well. In North Carolina, there was centralization was underway. Two agencies that were not Department of Commerce and Department of Health and Human Services were still not consolidated. They still had the opportunity to operate a little independently. They had to follow the rules and the processes, but their IT teams were direct reports into those particular agency leadership teams, not necessarily part of the centralized IT. So it depends, and I think it's very important for the vendor community, our strategic partners, to best understand the operating models that a state CIO and his or her team have to operate within, and then how do you play into that to enable successes that need to occur.
For sure, yeah, and what struck me in the examples you just walked through is that there's no better answer necessarily, right? Like both work and both get work done. I'm curious from your perspective, are there trade-offs? Like, what are the trade-offs you think that states make when they're moving to centralized over decentralized, or vice versa?
The big reason for going to centralization, and I will be upfront and honest, I'm a fan of centralization to a point. I think there's a number of shared services that a central or a singular entity can provide for the betterment of the state overall. But I will also tell you that I'm not necessarily a believer that central IT is close enough to the business to understand what the business needs to achieve and get done. And so if you want to call that a hybrid centralization, I'm not sure if we're making up new terms here or not. But when you think about networking, you think about infrastructure, data centers, cybersecurity, privacy guidelines, IT procurements.
Right.
There's a number of things here that I think a single entity would excel at doing, and it does generate cost savings overall for the state, not cost avoidance, true cost savings. Take cybersecurity as an example and a whole state approach. If the legislature would give everybody, or the state, $1, if you will, and that got divvied out across 30 agencies who then all go do the same thing, what's your return on investment?
Yes.
How are you building depth and defense from a cybersecurity perspective? How are you getting the necessary proactive measures? How are you effectively monitoring when you have all these different backdoor approaches into back-end administrative systems and things of that nature? So I'm just using that as an example where I think centralization does work very, very well. But like I said, when we think about business objectives and business outcomes, what I've seen in my career is a lot of times folks that work in the central IT organization have spent their entire careers in the central IT organization and don't fully understand and appreciate what agencies are trying to do and accomplish from a business objective perspective, and how frustrating it can be at times to have central IT just come in and say, well, no, you can't do that. Well,
Right. Yeah, and you grew up as an agency.
Yes, right. Human services in particular. And so, I knew like if the EBT file was not there at 6 a.m., people are already hitting the ATM machine trying to draw their cash benefits. They're already out at the grocery store trying to swipe their card at a point of sale device for necessary food items. My wife and I we have a disabled special needs daughter. It's something that hits personally home for us. And my wife is a retired human services employee as well. So to me, human services is one of those agencies where the rubber hits the road. And it's probably one of the most rewarding parts of my career, or time frame of my career, was also sometimes some of the most frustrating when you look at, the number of things. But, I got to see not only child welfare, I got to see child support, I got to see TANF, SNAP, Medicaid, state hospitals, state centers. When you think about mental health and developmental programs, aging, impact on aging, and having a mother who unfortunately had to go through that process until she had passed away. at least I had the advantage of being and knowing the business processes. It enabled me to better interact from a consumer perspective when the time came for me to engage in those services for my mom.
Yeah.
If you were somebody who did not have that visibility, government can be quite frustrating. When you think about between human services and Department of Aging, age matters when the person transitions from the set of programs over here in human services to over in the Department of Aging, and how do you navigate that change?
Sure.
So it's those.
Yeah, it should be seamless.
It should be seamless, right? But it's not, unfortunately. And so those are the kind of things that, I always told my teams, we can't talk in the terms of IT lingo. We have to talk to agencies in the terms of their business and their business jargon. As an example, when I came to North Carolina, I had Secretary Cohen, Samani Cohen, who ended up leaving Governor Cooper and joined. She was CDC director there for the remainder of the Biden years and the Biden administration. Secretary Kinsley, Cody Kinsley, another phenomenal individual, and some of his initiatives. But I understood their business, health and human services. That was 28 years of my career, was health and human services. So there are things that I could ask about and get into that enabled those conversations to go further. However, a lot of I had the knowledge, but a lot of our teams, like I said, grew up in central IT and did not have that business perspective. And so
what is the model there like? So I guess what I'm hearing is, point taken on cybersecurity and on other fundamental things too, networks, right? So that it makes sense that there's some commonality there, but then to the extent that there are truly unique business goals or requirements of a particular agency, it sounds like you would advocate for letting those people who are closest to it make those decisions. What is that mechanically though? Like as I've thought about it, and perhaps I'm wrong, but is there a way like with rules, and the way budgets are allocated to accommodate that?
Yeah, there is. That approach. Yeah, there truly is. And at the end of the day, Mike, it comes down to building relationships, and it's trust. So I will tell you, during my time frame in Pennsylvania, as an example, there were many times, and a good friend of mine was the Commonwealth CTO and later the State CIO. I kind of went up to him and said, "Look, I'm the 800-pound gorilla. I got money. Stay out of my way. Let me go do what I need to do." Now, again, I was being egotistical and flexing muscle. But at the same time, I'm like, I will work with you, and I will let me go build it for the enterprise. You can go then run what you need to go run and operate, but I can do it for you cheaper. And then I can just go ahead and continue to do what our agency business is. So it's not like we went on divergent paths. We were on parallel tracks and stayed aligned. But a lot of times I would be a little bit ahead of where his organization was at the time because I needed to, because I had the business pressures. So you think about during the days of healthcare reform, as an example, we had so many things to do. Would it surprise you if I told you that we did over 100 production releases in the course of a year? It was 50.
I'd be super impressed.
52 weeks, and if you looked at all the lower environments, we were well over 1,000 production or code pushes across a multiplicity of environments. Now, as I had the conversation, I used to call it my placemat. Had the conversation with the business. I had the business view. Here's all the work activities that are going on from your business view. Here's where we're working on reforming the common application form. We're doing this. Here's where we're doing the interaction to enable, provide your demographic data once, as an example, let it pre-populate across, and just to throw some quick things out there. But then I can flip it over to the other side and said, okay, that was your business world. This is what it means to me from my world. And from a business perspective, they got an appreciation. And then what allowed me to do is when I had things that needed to be done. So as an example, if you go back to the days of .NET frameworks when they were tied to a specific server operating system, I could sit there and say, hey, these applications, I need to move them forward on the .NET framework. While you're doing this business initiative, can I get a piece of that work order that allows for this and this to move forward? So essentially, while you got the patient open, let's go ahead and get a couple things done, close the patient up and move on, but we're not going to jeopardize your end date for your business objective you're trying to accomplish. And it really worked very well, to the point that as part of our governance strategy, as we were looking at fiscal year planning, at the end of the day, the first thing they would ask is, Jim, what do you need to have done? Right. And then we could get that kind of on the table first. And, you can't ask for everything. And you've known that from your career as well, whether it's business or government. You can ask for 100 things. You're only going to get 3 if you're lucky. Right.
So, and actually that was my very next question. So, I'm familiar with, I think correct me if I'm wrong, but you came into being State CIO of Washington in 2018, late 2018.
Yes, correct.
So I based on some homework I was doing, it sounded like there was a report done by a consulting group who was talking about some opportunities to improve the cost efficiency of the department.
I'm sorry, Mike, I chuckle when you say report. It was like 85 pages.
Oh yeah, right. Yeah, I didn't get through all of it. I read the first 20 or so. But yeah, I was just curious of your perspective. So you're coming in on the heels of that work. And the question that I always find fascinating is, how do you find what the most important thing to work on is? You've talked about that a little bit, but that sounds like a throwaway thing, but I think in practice it's actually quite difficult.
Yeah.
How did you know what the top objectives were?
Well, again, this goes back to knowing what right looked like, and very fortunate for my career in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, between the biggest agency in the state, moving over then into central IT and helping to be part of that consolidation effort. So I had a good idea of what good looked like, to be blunt.
Sure.
I was also very fortunate in my career to have a number of mentors who took time to teach me about procurement, budget, and personnel, or HR. So if you think about it, nothing gets done without the evil pitchfork of those 3 things. And I say that lovingly for anybody there. But I mean, at the end of the day, that's kind of, you need people, you need the ability to go buy things, and you need funding. It's quite simple. If you can master those skill sets and understand how the funds move around, it makes your job a lot easier. And I will be honest, the 85-page report is probably what really attracted me to the state of Washington. It was funny because my wife one night looked at me, and I still hadn't decided whether I wanted to go do this or not. And she just looked at me and she goes, go. And I mean, what do you mean go? And she goes, you're already solving their problems. I can see it. And yes,
go.
Yes. And I'm very fortunate to have an awesome spouse who has supported my career. And so, I ended up going. But to put it nicely, if there was a grade lower than an F-, that probably would have been in that report. The agency was upside down financially as well. And, so there's certain things that you have from a priority of fire perspective. So when you look at it, what's the governor trying to get accomplished? The interview process I went through, I actually was interviewed by my key legislative chairs, both on the House and the Senate side, as part of the interview process. I sat in a roundtable interview with a number of the agency leaders that were currently as part of the cabinet. And in Washington, it was a cabinet level position. It's just, we did not get called secretaries. Only the really, really big agencies were referred to as secretaries. But it was a cabinet level position, 1 of 25 sitting around the table. And then also, just coming in and there's certain things by law, the agency could not be in the red. It had to finish the fiscal year in black. So there are certain things that you knew you just had to go tackle right off the bat, and take a look at it. The agency also, again, nothing gets done without people. It doesn't matter how much automation you have at the end of the day, people are still a key component to everything you need to try to do. And so we had to rally and get folks to start believing in a new direction, a new purpose, that we're not here to basically be cast aside and, kicked to the curb and stomped on. And I can't tell you how many times I heard, well, you don't understand, Jim, that 30 years ago, blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, I had nothing to do with 30 years ago. I'm talking about now moving forward, and the analogy of the rearview mirror is small for a reason. The front window is big for a reason. I'm focused on where we're going. I'm going to be respectful of where we came from, but I'm going to focus on where we're going. And this is the things that we want to start going to do. And And again, too, also very fortunate that in the state of Washington, the legislature is pretty tech savvy. And so that also is a double-edged sword, because then there are times where certain legislative members will love to get in details that most legislators won't. But at the end of the day, they understood
Right.
the importance of what technology can bring, and the fact that there needed to be strong governance. They were not necessarily a fan of consolidation. That's just not the way of the Pacific Northwest. But at the same time, too, they
Yep.
understood the importance of investing dollars into automation, but investing dollars wisely. I still remember Senator Carlisle. He was my Senate Oversight Chair. He's now left the legislature, but One Washington, which is the ERP replacement project that's underway in Washington, he looked at me one day and said, Jim, if there's a 10% cost overrun on that project, I could, with that 10%, send every kid in foster care to a 4-year school. Those are impactful words when you think about it.
100%.
And so those are the kind of things where, as you go through and start looking at it, this is how we started to focus. And you can't change things overnight. You have to chip away. You have to, I had to prove myself and my credibility, because I was an unknown to the folks in the state of Washington. And
Yeah.
but as you made yourself available, as I would pop into meetings unexpectedly and just go jump up and sit on the counter in a meeting and just listen. And then I would also engage and ask questions as well. And I remember one gentleman who I asked the question, and his response was, "Well, this is awkward." And I'm like, "Well, why is it awkward?" "Well, you're here." And I'm like, "You all are the management team. If we can't talk here, we got bigger problems."
Right.
And it's just like, I don't want to say Vegas rules, but we're here. We need to have these conversations. I need to hear what you're thinking, so I have a better understanding of the
Right.
perspective you're bringing to the table. Um,
Yeah, which comes back to your point about trust.
exactly. Trust. And it's also
Yeah.
about getting diversity too, in the room. And I know diversity is a word that sometimes gets crushed for the wrong reasons, but it's really diversity in approaches, thinking, backgrounds, all those kind of things, where you need those different viewpoints to come forward. And I can't tell you how many
For sure.
times I thought this is how something should be done, to actually sit there. Huh, didn't think about that. That's a great point. How can we incorporate that into da 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 da?
Yeah.
And then you have the trust of the team, that they can sit there and say, I can even tell you, in North Carolina, my chief deputy was phenomenal of grabbing me by the neck and saying, "Jim, you're too far in front of us. Get back here."
Yeah.
Right.
Well, that's
And I used to,
that's
and that
partnership.
was my analogy of, there's a fine line between being a leader and leading from the front, and being a scout because you're too far in front. Um,
Yeah, I love that's another great
yeah.
analogy, like the front.
Yeah, and I always appreciated when
Windshield.
I got to the point where the team pushed back and said, "We got it."
Yeah.
Then I knew they had it, and I could go ahead and move on and look at other things as well. So yeah, it's
So could you? Okay, so a couple things I took away there. One was I like this pitchfork idea you talked about, where you have procurement, budget, personnel. I think that's great. Could you walk me through, from the perspective of the several states where you've done this firsthand? Could you walk me through like some of the similarities and differences in how like an initiative gets formed? Maybe from like, hey, this is a problem, or this is a goal of ours, all the way through like, okay, it's funded and it's in the budget. Are there differences, or is it even,
yeah,
how does that
and
work?
and some of this too also depends upon the executive branch and the legislative branch, and are they aligned, or how opposed are they? So
Okay.
take Commonwealth of Pennsylvania as an example. You know, the governor has line item veto capability for them, and so there's a different level of negotiation that can occur when you have some of that ability as you're working through a
Yeah.
budget process. When I went to the state of Washington, it was the same party in the legislature and the governor's office. It was a totally different type of environment that was going on there.
House, Senate, and
Yes,
governor.
yes. So if you want to think about it, it was more or less in Washington, the party there, which was Democratic, had this, which the governor was as well, had a supermajority.
Yep.
Go to North Carolina, it was quite the opposite, where I had a governor who was a Democrat and a legislature that had a super majority Republican base. And
Yeah.
It was a constant struggle. In fact, Governor Cooper, I believe, only signed 2 budgets in 8 years.
Wow.
And if last time I checked, I still believe North Carolina doesn't have an approved budget yet and they're wrapping up their 2-year budget, which should have been their 2-year budget, but they're still operating off of mini budgets or what's from there. There's just I hate to call it a CR, but it kind of operates like a continuing resolution for some things. But when you sat there and worked, a lot of times the budget was already dead on arrival that was being submitted to the legislature because they already had what they were going to go do. And the governor had either vetoed the entire thing or he had to sign it or let it go into law. There was no line on veto. So there wasn't a lot of ability to negotiate when you could override a veto at the end of the day. So it was interesting in those regards. I would tell you that probably Pennsylvania and Washington, we had the best when projects were assessed, they were put in as concept papers, if you will, and they were evaluated with recommendations that was provided to the governor's budget office.
Sorry, so the agency is putting together the concept.
They would put together the concept paper. In Washington's example, which I think had the most mature process, and was really pleased to see how that whole program portfolio management worked. That would come in. There would be a team of our people as well as other agency personnel that would look at and review them, and a score was generated. And so, if you had 100 projects that were identified for a fiscal year, they were ranked from 1 to 100. Now, just because you got
across the entire state.
Across the entire state, that is correct. And then there was recommendations. There was a synopsis of the project and a recommendation whether to fund, partially fund, don't fund at all. And then what the agency could possibly do, or what, if there was a caveat there of a partially fund, why only partially fund, right? What was the rationale behind that? And of course, even if you had certain projects where don't fund, if they were 100% federal funding, they're going to get funded. I mean, so let's be honest, because the color of money does matter, where the funding sources are coming from as well. So what's the impact to the state coffers versus what's the federal funds or federal fund or grants or whatever the other opportunities are going to come into that picture. So really understanding how things are being sourced.
Who's doing that stack ranking?
I'm sorry, say that again, Mike.
Who's doing? You talking about
We had a team, so we had portfolio managers, and then we also had other agency personnel sit in and help evaluate them as well. So it wasn't just a one-sided, or if you will, biased view of it. It was very unbiased, and it was a summation of what that entire team came up with. And like I said, then that was shared not only with the governor's office, it was also shared with the legislative staffers as well. So fiscal research, if I remember correctly, was the term for in the state of Washington. So they also saw what was being recommended. And what that did, though, was it didn't allow for agencies then to go backdoor into their oversight committees and say, hey, I need this, and because everybody had the same play sheet, if you will, that was being looked at across the board.
Right.
Now, again, for us, it was a recommendation. Ultimately, at the end of the day, the governor makes the decisions that need to be made. And once the governor sat there and said, this is what I want, but it was an informed decision, then that's what we went ahead and supported as it was going through the legislative, budgetary process in the state. Once it got funded, what I really liked in Washington was that...
I make sure I understand that part too.
Yeah.
So you then get all the projects that come in, you and various other people who are, with different points of view, stack rank them, and then you present essentially like these recommendations to the governor, and the governor goes through and says, I want to move forward with these. Basically, you're presenting your recommendations, and the governor is approved.
Correct. And again, just because we had something ranked low, it might have been, from his perspective, it might have been more important. Again, at the end of the day, the governor's the boss. But the thing that was unique there is not only did we present over to the governor's budget, we also presented over to the legislative fiscal research folks. So the legislative branch and the executive branch had the same, again, baseline that we were all working from. Once the governor said, this is what we need to have done, and was put in the governor's budget office, that's what we moved forward with and supported. Once it got funded, what would happen is,
and
go ahead.
I want to make sure I'm wrapping my mind around this. So basically, because the governor and the legislatures were blue, what the governor put forth in the budget was more or less approved.
Yeah,
Is that
yeah,
fair?
yeah. Yeah, that's a fair statement.
Okay. Whereas if you were doing that in North Carolina, you could have the same process where you have a way of coming up with the projects. Governor says, cool, cool, cool. They get put forth in the budget, and then they're like, no,
Yeah.
we're not moving.
Yeah, and we did implement, but surprisingly, as I read my stat authorizing environment, the process was there to do that. But we did work very collaboratively with the governor's budget office, or Office of Financial Management, or OSBM in this case, Office of State Budget Management in North Carolina, to kind of assess and evaluate projects, make a recommendation. But there at the end of the day, though, that was not shared with the legislature; it was shared with the governor. And then the governor's team would sit there and make the recommendations of what they want to move forward with. And then that's what we would definitely go ahead and support when it went into the legislative process. But to your point, it could be a little cantankerous. Yeah.
Okay. And okay, so if the governor is aligned with the legislature, the process is, agencies are putting together their plans, they get reviewed, prioritized, approved by the governor, put into the budget, legislature more or less approves the budget. What about in a situation, though, where you do have, for lack of a better term, you do have a CR? How is that? How are those initiatives still selected and prioritized in that?
Well, you're not doing new initiatives under a continuing resolution. So a CR by definition is to sustain the ongoing operations, if you will, of the state while the budget's being negotiated.
So does that mean no new CapEx and OpEx?
At times, yes. Yeah,
Okay.
and so I'll give you an example, Mike. So like in the state of North Carolina, you had recurring funding and you have one-time funding sources. A lot of initiatives were funded through a one-time funding source because the legislature did not necessarily want to go ahead and commit the state to a recurring expense over multiple years, which I can understand and appreciate. The issue that came, though, is North Carolina operates on a biennial budget. So when that 2-year window ended, come July 1 of the new budget year, that one-time funding ended as well, even though there was no budget to continue to move forward. And if it was, operating under a CR, unless they passed a quote unquote mini budget that specifically said we are authorizing agency X amount of dollars for this explicit purpose, those one-time funding sources would dry up until the budget was again reauthorized. And so when you look at a number of initiatives, there were times where you were scrambling, working with the vendors, looking at different ways to fund some things because it was historically being paid out of one-time funding sources, and that funding pool dried up until it got replenished. And you had to figure out how to cover the gap.
Yeah, I'm curious. What are some of the clever ways that you're able to fund a project in that?
Well, and then there's other things that go into that, then, Mike. So it's not a clear answer or an easy answer, because you have to take a look at what's your cash flow. Are you cost recovery, or is your IT operations funded through the legislature through appropriations?
Is that at the project level or at the portfolio?
Well, I'm just saying from an overall budget aspect, because there are certain things that depending upon how the funding was sourced, you might be able to redirect funds to plug other holes. And in some cases, you may not. Okay. So because then you run very quickly into what's called a SWICAP cap issue, where you're I don't want to say misusing funds, but funds that were collected for a specific purpose. Right, exactly. And there's state and federal implications with that as far as penalties go. So you have to really be careful. You also have to take a look at what's the cash flow that you're going through as an agency. So I can tell you, like, my cash flow was $1 million a day going out the door for expenses, which sounds like a lot of money, but at the end of the day, it was $365 million, which really in the end, it's not a lot of money. I can't believe I just said that, but it's really not a lot of money when you think about it. But then you had to sit there and put in, I had to make sure I had money to account for payroll, and making sure people were getting paid. By law, I was supposed to have, I believe, 30 days of cash flow available in the books. So again, $1 million a day, that would be about 30 million. It would be based upon how quickly.
Sorry, and that means that I'm curious of the technical details there. So by law, your department has to have 30 days of cash flow. So if you're burning, for lack of a better term, $1 million a day, that means that the bank account for the IT department or the CIO's office has to have that much
Yeah,
money? How does that
essentially.
work?
I mean, and there would be ebbs and flows. I mean, it's kind of like you're managing your checkbook. I mean, if you think about it from that, your
Right.
personal banking account, there's a level that you don't want to go below, but there's times you have to go below it because there's going to be on the back end, you're going to see the
Right.
deposits, if you will, being made. But what you had to be
Right.
careful about when you're going through a budget impasse or these types of situations is that agencies also needed those funds to be able to pay their bills. So I will tell you, like the Department of Transportation North Carolina always paid us a quarter in advance. Well, that doesn't necessarily mean I can use that money. But when you looked at my balance sheet, it would look like I'm sitting on a lot of money. Well, when you look at that, that these are funds that I had to use for shared services being consumed. Here was $100 million sitting in the balance sheet that was for NextGen 911, had to be explicitly used for that. When you looked at the funds that were
Right.
coming into our agency through the broadband program, that was another. But at the end of the day, I probably had anywhere between $10 to $15 million of discretionary spending when you would look at the overall amount of dollars that were sitting on our balance sheet.
Jim, I want to go back to something that you brought up before, just in terms of how the budget actually comes together. Could you step us through how that budget gets put together chronologically over the course of a year?
Yeah, I think it's good for clarity purposes to have a good understanding of what that cycle looks like. So normally, and from my experiences across 3 states, usually in the October timeframe is when an agency is going to start developing concept papers, or sometimes they're called program revision requests, if I use the term PRR. And that is really looking at big ticketed items, policy changes, requested legislative changes, things of that nature, to be considered not only from a financial aspect, but also from if this is something the administration would like to do and push forward as far as legislation goes. Once you go through that process, then normally in December timeframe, roughly, is usually when agencies will be finalizing their budget and actually submitting it over to a governor's budget office, who then normally will take January, February timeframe to kind of put it all together for the administration to announce, i.e., the governor. Normally at some type of address in front of the legislature, whether it's the state address or something along those lines, and that would normally occur somewhere between February and the April timeframe. Then usually from April through June, the legislature is going to do what the legislature does, and hopefully enact a budget or present a budget for signature for July 1, a start date. Now, what happens then is you never get everything you ask for. So what happens then after the budget is actually passed and signed is you go through a rebudget or a budget certification process, which you asked for X, you got Y. Now here's what Y is. How are you going to do things a little bit differently? And you have to go through that process to make sure that the funds end up where the funds need to be. And that normally then once that occurs, that's when you basically get your spending authority to go ahead and start using those funds appropriately. But once you go through the rebudget process, you got right around the corner this thing called the federal budget.
Right.
And you got the September, October timeframe. And the federal budget, whether there is a budget, a continuing resolution, a shutdown, whatever, that can also adversely impact what you were planning on doing as well. And especially if you're a big agency like a human services agency that is dependent upon lots of federal dollars, you may have to start looking at what do you need to, back off? What do you need to slow down?
Can
What
I
are the
stop you
stock?
there?
Yeah, go
Does the
ahead.
federal budget, so you talked about like the health and human services aspect of it. Does
Mhm.
the federal budget, when it comes down, does it have departmental, like specific departmental ramifications, and or are there also kind of just like across the board, the state budget gets cut by X% potentially?
No, it's more impactful on programs that have federal funding associated with it. So
So
take
it's at the
human
program
services as
level.
an example, correct?
Yeah.
There are certain programs that might be 100% federally funded that you are operating from a state perspective, and now you need
Hmm.
to sit there and account for the lack of those funds. Do you temporarily subsidize it with state money to continue the program, which now means a deviation from what you had planned on doing? Do you temporarily suspend the program? How do you pay those employees that are federally funded? There's a whole bunch of things that go on behind the scenes. And I will tell you, during my time in human services in Pennsylvania, the human services budget, when you throw in the federal dollars, was bigger than the state budget.
Wow.
You look at it from its entirety, and if you think about all the federal dollars that come down through various, whether it's SNAP, TANF,
Hmm.
Medicaid, long term living, developmental programs, early learning, child welfare,
Yeah.
child support enforcement. You think about all those things that are there. A tremendous amount of federal funds pour into a human services agency, as an example. So you go through the federal budget process, and the federal budget could end up dictating you need to do some things a little bit differently, which then leads you right back into that cycle in October, November. You're starting your PRRs, your concept papers all over again. And so, from a financial aspect, the budget folks never really get a chance to cycle down. It's a continuous year-long process, wash, rinse, repeat.
Got it. That's super fascinating. Thank you for walking through that. To double click on it, what I would love to hear your perspective on is, okay, so now let's add the vendor community into this cycle. How have you seen, maybe give us a best in class example of how a vendor has supported, and played a supporting role in getting a project, defined, agreed to, funded, and then implemented throughout that budget cycle. And also, where do people step out of bounds too?
Yeah. So the vendors will engage lobbyists, government affairs, consultants, whatever terminology you want to refer to that population, and they do serve a very important role. I know at times they're looked upon with like they're this evil thing. I refer to the lobbying community as the force. There's the good uses of the force and the bad uses of the force, and we'll talk a little bit about that. When we look at it from the good side of the fence, lobbyists do have the ability to go and influence a lot of times on the legislative side. They understand the key stakeholders that are involved in conversations, especially at the financial level. You have your big budget chairs. When things go in a caucus, what's going on there, they can kind of help influence some of those outcomes there as well. And so, if there are initiatives that you do need to get pushed through, the lobbyists through a vendor, because we're not directly working with lobbyists, can orchestrate things in a way to basically get dollars set aside for specific functions, such as $25 million for the purposes of centralization of cybersecurity. Keep it something at the high level of that, which then allows the vendor community to have that opportunity to go ahead and compete for that type of business. Now, what happens on the bad side of the force is when take that same exact example, and a lobbyist pushes for 25 million for cybersecurity, specifically to bring in a specific product set. Then you start getting into that side that is counterproductive. When legislatures name product sets, it really takes away the ability for the state to effectively negotiate good terms and conditions from a contract perspective, good pricing from a contract perspective. And a lot of times a vendor's reluctance, because they'll sit there and say, well, you're required by law to do this.
Mm-hmm.
The counterpart and the best argument I ever heard in response to that was, and I won't tell you what state, but there's plenty of laws on the books. We kind of effectively choose which ones we're going to follow. And so the example was speed limits. How many people speed? We know it's against the law, but guilty.
Yeah. Right. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. And so it was kind of that example of, just because it's in black and white doesn't necessarily mean that it's something that has to be done the way it was prescribed. So that's an example where work with the public sector to enable the opportunities that feed into what the governor's trying to do. It's feeding into what the state CIO or even a county local government CIO is looking to try to accomplish, and enable the process for them. And you're going to start making some very quick friends, and those relationships last forever when they know they have a strategic partner who's there to work with them, not,
of course,
the other way around.
So one thing, as I was studying your background, that I thought was a really fascinating example of this was back in Washington, there was this Mainframe-as-a-Service deal, right? Mm-hmm. And it saved Washington millions of dollars a year. I'd love if you could walk through how that procurement actually happened. And then if you could also, since we're talking about budgets, this was like when you talk about as a service, you're moving from CapEx to OpEx. And I just love to hear, some of the challenges associated in doing that. Or was it just like in every way, was it better?
Yeah, so I will tell you that. I mean, I would love to tell you that I was revolutionary and it was the best thing I've ever thought of. No, in this Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, we had been doing mainframe outsourcing since the late 1990s through a cumulative contract that included Unisys and IBM. So if you looked at the mainframe compute environment of the Commonwealth, Human Services had a Unisys mainframe, and others had the IBM mainframe platform. We effectively did a contract. It was called PACS, PA Compute Services, that led to the consolidation of those activities and brought all those disparate mainframes together on single platforms. So, if you will, it was a private cloud offering, but it was the genesis of looking at what could occur. Fast forward out to the state of Washington, we had a significant problem. We were running on legacy equipment. It did not make sense to me to continue when you look at the number of agencies that were looking to offload, modernize their mainframe applications, move them to cloud-based opportunities. And again, we're in the state of Washington with Microsoft and AWS in our backyard. A cloud migration was going to be inevitable. And so why lock us into a long-term contract or something along those lines that would end up resulting in us owning and operating a mainframe environment? Plus, we also know staffing numbers. We also know the alleged silver tsunami was coming, all those kind of things. And then we also were going into the COVID timeframe as well. And so it just made sense to us as a leadership team to go ahead and look to move this to an as a service opportunity, which protected the state and also, more importantly, protected our customer base as others were able to successfully migrate away from mainframe application. Last man standing wasn't holding the proverbial bag of cost. We were able to effectively reduce that. One of the things that we did do, however, is we really took a hard look at our staffing and make sure our staff was taken care of in this process. So it wasn't just moving the technology, it was also making sure that our personnel were accounted for in this process. Those who wanted to potentially look at another career and move with the supplier that was chosen, in this case, it was Insono, those opportunities were enabled. For those that wanted to look at other opportunities of remaining in the state and doing IT, we enabled those work development opportunities so they could make that transition. And then we had a few that just they just wanted to retire. They were done. They did not want to go and move on. And respectfully, we honored that as well. And then we had to have a couple people who had that program knowledge, right? Because in the end of the day, as you move this and you move it to a supplier initiated model, you still need to have that bridge there between the state and the vendor who truly knows what's going on from a day-to-day program operation aspect. And so that's when we started really looking at that whole program portfolio type concept and moving people into that role as well. So all in all, it was a very good transition. We actually did it during COVID. And there's many across the country who looked at COVID as being it slowed us down. And in the state of Washington, it was an accelerator for us. I often commented that COVID was the chief innovation officer for us. It really opened up a lot of doors. It got us a lot of credibility with agencies because it was our moment to shine. I remember saying to Governor Inslee once that, respectfully, Governor, you have a Corvette sitting in the garage. Let us go out and spin that thing around the block. You're going to be amazed what we can do. And that's what happened.
Yeah. Do you think one thing I've heard, and on the topic of like mainframe, because a lot of times you'll hear these stories, and I was speaking with someone who was a CIO of a federal agency. We'll leave it unnamed. And what this person shared was that a lot of the technology that was supporting the most integral, required high uptime, like the tolerance for downtime or errors was very low. So naturally, I think in those cases, if it's not broke, don't fix it, right? Like that's a sensible, logical way to think about it. But in many cases, some of these things are still running on COBOL, at least at the federal level. And so when I was talking with this person about, does it make sense? Like, how do you think about transitioning to the cloud? One of the arguments that came up, I'm curious of your take on it, is like, look, like these are mainframes that are, well tested. It's running very efficient programs. Like if we switched it to the cloud, the cost to serve would be greater just being in a cloud environment than in a mainframe. And I'm curious of your take on that, because I also, when you're in a mainframe environment, I would imagine that like adding functionality is harder and more expensive. So how do you think about those cost
Yeah,
trade-offs?
yeah. So it depends. I mean, if you think about financial markets are still heavily mainframe based, and mainframe technology works extremely well. It's very reliable, very dependent,
Yeah, many
and
people
very
would be
good at
shocked
what
to
it
know that
does. Right,
mainframe sales annually they've grown
right.
over the last several decades. They haven't shrunk.
But to your point, do you have personnel who can keep the systems current? Now, what's interesting is 5, 6 years ago, I may have a different opinion than where I'm at today, because I think what we're going to start seeing today is with the advent of generative AI, we're going to start seeing more in-house development activities that are led by generative AI as it relates to COBOL programming and things to do, versus looking for those COBOL programmers and pulling them out of retirement and being fearful that all our knowledge base is leaving. I think generative AI is going to probably extend the ability of the mainframe to continue doing what it's doing. But still, at the end of the
Yeah,
day, you got to keep it current. Just like any other infrastructure, you got to keep the hardware current, you got to keep the operating systems current, and you need to still go through those cycles to make sure you have regression testing and all the other things that you need around that. I will tell you the biggest fear, and we also did a mainframe. We moved the mainframe environment in North Carolina as well, from on-prem ownership to the cloud as well. And believe it or not, Insona won that bid as well. No relation in there between there, but at least from my perspective, it was a known entity. And there was a lot of concern for that. And a lot of things you just talked about. Well, it's in the cloud. It's not going to work. And my question was fundamentally, what is the difference between me bringing in a new mainframe and sitting it aside of the current one versus a mainframe sitting in someone else's data center? You still have to do the same level of testing. And you're going to know very, very quickly within the first hour or so whether or not the migration has been successful. That is the beauty of the mainframe environment. Now, I came up on the open systems side, so I'm not a mainframe guy. I'm not advocating for mainframes or endorsing them or anything along those lines, but very quickly you would know whether or not it was functioning correctly or not. And so there was a lot of fear and consternation, and we were able to successfully move the mainframe environment away from a state-owned data center into the Insono cloud, if you will, to go ahead then, and that was very successful and continues to operate. And then again, you're staying current, which is the beauty of it all, right? It's minimizing risk at the end of the day.
right. Yeah, and I think that's a phenomenal example of like a initiative gone really well. Another one from your career that I wanted to ask you about was the NextGen 911 work that you did in North Carolina. I mean, and you had like you know, with Hurricane Helene, like an amazing example to showcase all of that work. But from what I know, it sounds like all 124 PSAPs within the state migrated over. There was multiple vendors involved, and it got stress tested, like we said, during Helene. So I would be curious, like, walk us through that initiative. How did that get formed
Yeah, I
and
mean,
executed?
yeah, so I was fortunate to come into a good situation in North Carolina, so I can't take all the credit for it. Secretary Eric Boyette, who preceded me, was at the Genesis, and the best thing that Eric did was hired a lovely lady by the name of Pokey Harris, who was our NextGen 911 executive director, a woman who's extremely passionate about this area, public safety. She's just unbelievable. But 125 PSAPs, as you said, across 100 counties. We run on when you think about it, I think what made NextGen 911 successful here in North Carolina is it was seen as a technology project, not as a business. So at the end of the day, when you think about it, high-speed network, GIS, call routing, call processing, automated distribution, the core fundamentals of what goes on behind the scenes is all technology related, and having it as part of DIT, or Department of Information Technology, really enabled those opportunities for us to do some things across the state in a very collaborative and collective manner. Now, there's funding that comes with it. On the phone bill, there's a surcharge. One of the things we were able to do is actually reduce that surcharge as well. So as we were continuing to build out, we had this interesting problem in North Carolina. People just kept moving to the state. And as much as we were trying to reduce our revenues and collection, the more people came in, the more revenue came in off of those phone bills. It's a nice problem to have. But what it did allow us to do then is start to look at other things. One of the things we did across our PSAP community was cybersecurity assessments. Um, Take a look at your operation. What are the known vulnerabilities that are out there? And then more importantly, having funding available for you to go fix those vulnerabilities, which was something I was very passionate about as well. It's great to get a report that knows here's everything that's wrong. If you sit there and put it in the file cabinet and then 6 months later you become victim of that, what did we accomplish other than we told you so? So we really, as we were identifying things, we had the means and the mechanism to go ahead and fix things as well, which was extremely important. But the resiliency of what was created was just very, very impressive. And when you brought up Western North Carolina, the devastation that occurred out there, our PACE plan out the window. We had resiliency, redundancy to include from a wireless perspective, diverse entry, diverse carriers. It didn't matter when there's no towers anymore or on those kind of things. But probably one of the smartest things, and I'll give Pokey credit for this, she was kind of like her phone a friend program, where each region of the state, and we divide the state up into 4 regions. So you pick a friend in each of the other regions, and automatically, if something would happen to you, we're automatically rerouting your calls over to them. Little did we know that 2 months earlier, when we put that in place, to have what happened in Western North Carolina go through, to the point that we did not lose a single 911 call that was made from Western North Carolina.
That's unbelievable.
We actually had some incidents where, we had a trucker get stuck. He called his wife, who called 911. I think she was in Texas. Texas 911 called up to us, and we were able to route that call over to somebody who needed it without the trucker ever dropping connectivity, and got him rescued, if you will, along those lines. And probably the biggest thing that we had was, and this is the human element, because again, nothing happens without the humans in this. The PSAP community, the workers, phenomenal people, and for what they do on a day-to-day basis. And when you spend some time with them, and you're listening to a person walking somebody through CPR administration, or you have a spouse who's dispatching her husband, who's a police officer, out to a potential crime scene. Just how locked in they get. Forgetting the fact
100%.
that was her husband. She's locked in on doing what she needs to do. And then how many generations of families are in the law enforcement community? It's kind of like it's in the genetics, I think. I don't know. It's just truly amazing when you get out there and you see what these folks are doing. But the biggest problem we had was we had the PSAPs that were impacted wanting to get back into the game, and we couldn't assure that there would be stability to bring them back up. Because if you could imagine, as they were doing cleanup, a fiber line would get cut, and the fiber line would get fixed, and they would go further down the road, and what would happen? A fiber line got cut again. And so we had to keep them out, and that was so frustrating for the people because they wanted to be there serving their community. And it's just truly amazing when you're watching that kind of spirit and love for what's going on in their community. And we had to find ways to try to get them back into the game, if you will, sooner than probably was. But there were certain things that we were not going to bring a PSAP up until we had a certain level of confidence that we were able
to wouldn't go back down.
Right.
Yeah. I know we have limited time left, and I really wanted to get your take on one final topic, and that is AI. I've read some of what you've written on this, and you've talked about AI cost of ownership and asking legit questions. Is this going to be a $50 a month expense, or a $15K a month expense, or $150K a month expense? Right. We don't know because it's consumption based, right? What are your thoughts on that? Because I do think I have empathy from the AI company side of it, right? Like they are incurring costs relative to their usage, so they want to charge users relative to theirs. But obviously that creates this issue where cost is not really entirely known. There's some things you can do to address that, having you buy a certain amount of credits in bulk.
Yeah, there's 2 parts to this, because if you think about it, AI is increasing costs. If you start looking at the supply chain issues that are out there across the tech industry right now, how much of that is basically because of AI and what's going on. And we're seeing prices go up as much as 200% over the course of the
On what?
months on RAN technology. Just take that alone. When you look at
Yeah.
chipsets and chipset
Yeah.
viability and supply, those kind of stuff,
Right. Yep.
it's just. And I think I heard today that hyperscalers are going to be spending $1 trillion over the next year, and that's going to continue to drive up costs as well. So you have that component of it. But if you think about it from a personal perspective, I mean, AI is here. It what needs to make sure, or what we need to make sure occurs, is there's a human in the loop, that you do not sit there and take what AI is providing you as golden. I was recently doing some bios, and I had the prompts, and I was going out and bringing material together, and it was for people I knew, so I could scale through it or scan through it quickly and say, okay, yep, I know that sounds pretty spot on. And then I took the same prompt and ran it on me for giggles, and apparently I served in the Gulf War for 6 years. Now,
thank you for your service.
The Gulf War in the last 6 years, right? I don't know where it hallucinated and found that or whatever, but I just use that as an example that you have to sit there and make sure you're taking a good look at it. What I'm curious to see is today AI and Gen AI, if you will, is really being informational reporting. When we begin to make that transition of public sector to it acting and doing on behalf of an individual, so it really, at the end of the day, it's going to come down to, it's not necessarily AI in the tool set. It's going to be, what is the data readiness, the data quality that AI is going to be accessing, because it has a lot of capability, as we know, but bad data gets you bad results. And when we start talking about a tool making a decision that impacts a human's outcome, and again, go back to my days in human services, there was always a reason why there was a caseworker that had authorized a case, even though systemically we had all the calculations, we could do all that but there are still the times where you need that human override to sit there and say, well, what the system came up with, I don't agree because of this, and this, and I'm going to go ahead and authorize a case. And that
for sure.
Really,
yeah, and I am very much in that camp where I think humans plus AI is
Yes.
going to be the future for the foreseeable future. I mean, there's obviously chirpings in Silicon Valley of who's going to need the humans, but I don't think that that's been true of technology in the past. Like, even if you look at job openings now for software engineers, from the last 6 months, they're increasing. But everyone's supposed to be supposedly saying like, oh, the programming is going away because AI writes the code now. So I don't see that showing up in the data yet, but so I agree with everything you're saying.
And then and you talked a little bit about the cost models. And so when you look at a public sector entity who has a finite budget and has to service a population of a state or of a governmental jurisdiction, the growth of those programs and those services has a corresponding impact then to, if AI is a core component of those processes, then how does that grow proportionately? And when we're looking at what's going on across supply chain and everything else, I don't know if we fully understand yet what the cost of this is going to look like down the road. And so that's where my hesitation comes in. But I think, is AI here to stay? The answer is yes. Are we going to have to learn to make use of it? Is it going to change how we do some things? I've heard already, I think it was in India, where radiologists, basically AI is now doing radiology. And it can take the scans, and it can read the scans and pinpoint that. So the good news is you're getting your results almost instantaneously. The bad news is it may not be a human radiologist doctor that's now reading your X-ray.
Well, yeah, right. That could be good news too, because if it drives down false negatives and false positives, that benefits everyone.
Yeah.
And I think humans have shown the capacity, to be able to shift from agriculture to manufacturing to other things. So I think,
Mike, and I know we're at the end, but I've made this comment before as well. If you put out launch an AI initiative and it's 40% right, Some folks would sit there and say that's a complete failure. Other folks might sit there from a business perspective and say, wait a minute, you just took 40% of my workload away from me that I can now do something else. So it's not
Exactly. Yeah.
necessarily, and by the way, to your point, humans make mistakes too. A human's not
Totally.
100% right. So why do we
Yeah, they get
expect
tired, you know.
right?
We've all read the thing about you want to get your court case right after lunch when the judge has eaten lunch, right? Like so that all makes sense. And Jim, I really appreciate your time. You've shared so many awesome stories of how government gets stuff done effectively. So thank you for your leadership, and I really appreciate you spending the time.
Well, thank you, Mike, for taking time with us. Thank you so much.